Hello everyone, glad to have you here. Thank you all for joining me today. Today we are going to continue working on this Laravel application that we have been building for the past 2 or 3 weeks. It's an Airbnb-like application, Laravel application, where people can go make reservations on offices that they can use for remote work. In the past streams, we worked on listing the different offices and allowing people to create offices for hosts. If you have a room like this and you would like to rent it for other people to do remote work, you can do that. So we finished that, managing offices, and then we switched to working on filtering through the reservations so people can view the reservations that they made in the past or ones that are incoming in the future, and hosts can search through the reservations that were made on offices that belong to them. So that's where we stopped yesterday. And today we are going to continue working on the filtering through reservations endpoint, but we have some items on some housekeeping to do before we get started. So let me share my screen so we can talk all about it. Alright, so this is the to-do list for today. Before we continue working on the list reservations endpoint, we are going to discuss this issue from last stream, where we're trying to use Sanctum as the default guard for authentication, and we hit some issues with testing, and we are going to start with that and then use the new assert not soft deleted method that was added to the framework. But first I need to make sure that I have the framework up to date, so let's run composer update first before we continue. And then we will use the new refresh database lazily, or it was converted to lazily refresh database. It's a trait that allows us to refresh the database between tests only when tests require connecting to the database. The refresh database trait that's already existing in the framework, it refreshes the database connection by running the migrations before every test, even if the test is not going to communicate with the database, and it's a waste of time and waste of machine resources if you consider that. So we are going to use the new lazily refresh database trait. And I think we are on the latest Laravel. We can use all the new goodies that were shipped in the Laravel 8.62.0. But before we start, I would like to thank GitHub user Crystal, because I would like to thank GitHub user Crystal because he sent a pull request that allows us to, or improves the performance of the query that used to filter or to sort the offices by which one is nearest or closest to a specific geographical location. So he sent a pull request that removes the square root function, and it should improve the performance of this query. So thank you again for Crystal for this pull request. And we are ready to start. Just a quick look at the chat to see what your guys are saying. Hi from Bangladesh, from Sweden. Hi from Pakistan, Croatia. I'm sorry, Diallo, I can't pronounce the name of this place, so sorry about that. Hello from Paris, hi there. Ahla min Masr, hello there from Egypt. And Steve King from UK, hi Steve. And alright, hello from Portugal, hello from Algeria, from Kashmir. Alright, happy to have you guys here with me today. So let's get started. Now, let's talk about the Sanctum issue. To summarize the problem, in this endpoint, the office controller, the index method where it's used to list all the offices in the system, if you are trying to filter offices using a user ID, a specific user ID, and this user ID belongs to the logged in user. So you are trying to view your own offices, the ones that you offer to other people to rent. If you are trying to do that, then we are going to list all the offices. Otherwise, if you are trying to filter by a user ID and this user is not the current logged in user, or you are not even logged in because this endpoint is exposed to the public, it's not protected by the authentication middleware. If you're just trying to filter by a specific user, or you are not trying to filter by a user at all, we are going to only list results that are approved by the administrators of the application and are not hidden by the host of the office. So only if you are viewing offices that belong to you, we are going to show all the listings, not just the listings that are approved or hidden. And that makes sense. The problem here is that because this endpoint is not protected by the authentication middleware, like for other endpoints, they are protected by the OAuth authentication middleware using the sanctum guard, but the index route here, it's not protected by the authentication middleware. When the Laravel application tries to identify the logged in user here, it's going to assume that it is using the default guard, and the default guard is set to the web guard. But we are using Sanctum for this project, so we should always use the Sanctum guard. The tests pass, like if we provide a test to test this endpoint and we use the acting as testing helper, it will pass because the acting as testing helper is going to use the default authentication middleware, which is the web middleware, or the I'm sorry, it's going to use the default guard, which is the session guard. And since we are faking a logged in user using the session guard, and in this endpoint we are trying to extract the logged in user using the session guard because it's the default guard here, the tests will pass, no problem. However, if you try to send an HTTP request to this endpoint, auth user will return null, even though it should return something. We expect it to return something. So here, if we send the request, auth user equal null. If we send an authorization header and send the request again, it's still null. Even though we are sending a valid authentication token, Laravel wasn't able to extract the logged in user because it's trying to find the logged in user using the session guard, which is not what we are using here. We want this endpoint to be able to authenticate users using Sanctum, the Sanctum guard. And the Sanctum guard is actually, it's a combo of two guards. The session guard, it's the session guard. It first tries to authenticate the user using the session guard, and if not, it's going to try to authenticate them using the token guard. So if we want this endpoint to be able to extract the user using the Sanctum guard, we will need to specify the guard here. So we say the guard is Sanctum, and then when we send the HTTP request, Laravel was able to identify the logged in user from the token. But we don't want to have to call the auth guard every time we don't want to specify the guard, because this application is going to use Sanctum. We are not going to use any other guard. So it makes sense to convert the application to use the Sanctum guard by default instead of the web guard. And now we can remove this. And if we send the request again, it will return results because it will use the default guard, which is the Sanctum guard. So switching to Sanctum to become the default authentication guard fixes this endpoint. It's going to work as it should. However, it's going to break the tests. Let's run PHP artisan test. Sorry, PHP artisan test. Okay, so we have this recurring issue that I have to create this directory here. New directory, unit. All right, let's run the tests. And we can see there are several failures. And it's considering our request unauthorized, even though the tests should run as expected. And the reason for that, if we go to the office controller test and we try one of the endpoints that are protected by the authentication middleware, like it creates an office. So PHP artisan test filter, it creates an office. Sorry, not this. Yeah, it creates an office. It's using the sanctum guard here. Let's try another thing. Yeah, I'm trying to find a test, one of the tests that are failing. Yeah, so let's try it updates an office. It updates an office and it's failing. And the reason for that is because we are using the acting as method, the helper, the test helper, the acting as test helper, which will basically authenticate the user using the session guard. So to the application, the user is logged in using the session guard, and it's protected by the sanctum guard. And this will not work because we are faking a user in a different guard than the one that we are using as the default. So to fix that, we need to always be using the sanctum acting as helper instead of this acting as here. And the problem is, if we want to use that and make it work, we will always have to identify the abilities or just offer all the abilities. If we run this test again, it's now passing. So this is the fix, because we are faking the user using the sanctum guard and the application is authenticating the user using the sanctum guard. It's all working fine. So all we need to do to fix the issue that we faced last time is to use sanctum acting as. But I don't want to keep having to provide the abilities. I want to be able, or I want to use acting as without having to identify the abilities, because the abilities are only affecting token-based authentication. But if the user is logged in using session-based authentication, the abilities doesn't make sense, and I don't need to bother with that in my tests. So to fix that, I'm going to override this acting as method. And in the default test case, I'm going to override the acting as method, and I'm going to use the sanctum acting as under the hood and provide the abilities, return this here. And we don't need this argument because we will always be using the sanctum guard. So this, and by default we will use the wildcard ability, so it passes for all requests. So now we can use the acting as method like usual without having to change the test, and the test should pass. And that's it. Now if we run our tests, we can see that all the tests are passing again because we are overriding the acting as method to use the sanctum acting as. And we can of course drop that and use the acting as method since we are using it under the hood here, but I will do that behind the scenes after the stream so we don't have to waste time on that. So I hope the issue is clear, and how we fixed it is clear to you by now. Let me take a look at the chat. Yes, Azul, Sanctum will try to use the session guard by default, but if the session cookie is not available with the request, it will try to use the token guard. So what we did here is that we need to fake the logged in user within the tests using the sanctum method instead of the built-in framework acting as helper method. So that's the fix. This will fix the situation that where the endpoints will try to use the sanctum guard while the tests are faking on the session guard. So this fixes it. I think this needs a fix in the framework Well, it doesn't. If you're not using Sanctum, the acting as method in the framework will just work just fine. If you are using Sanctum, you need to use the acting as method that is available under Sanctum, not the one that's available in the framework. So we cannot assume that everyone will be using Sanctum. We have to let people use the method that matches the authentication mechanism that they are using. All right, Rust, you promised what you promised me on the last stream, that I will show the line numbers. Well, I tried to do that, but it's very distracting to me. Like when I see the line numbers here, it looks distracting to me. So I'm not sure if I should show it. I don't see the point. So I'm not gonna do that. I'm sorry. So let's now move to the next item, which is to use the assert not soft deleted method. And to do that, we will go to the office controller test, and there was this test. Instead of this, we can use the assert not soft deleted and provide the office and get rid of this part. Run the tests and all is good. Now we use this new method. All right, now we can switch to the new lazily refresh database instead of just refresh database, and we can use that in all the test classes. Yep. And user reservation controller, we can use that here as well. Use lazily refresh database. Let's run the tests and we are good to go. Now this is done. Let's move to the list reservations endpoint. You should get rid of the unit folder error by removing it from the PHP unit XML. Well, I think I want to keep it just in case if we are going to write a unit test. I'm not sure, so I'll just keep it for now. Now, last time we decided that the list reservations endpoint, we will split them into two endpoints. One to list the reservations that the logged in user made, and another endpoint to list reservations that were made on offices that belong to the logged in user. So we will separate reservations that you make yourself and reservations that are made on your offices if you are a host. So we decided to split them into two controllers: user reservation controller and host reservation controller. The index method of the user reservation controller would have filtering like this. We can filter by an office ID, specific office ID. All the queries here are filtered by the current logged in user. So in this endpoint, we will only list reservations that belong to you, the ones that you made yourself. And you can filter by specific office ID, you can filter by the status, you can filter by date. And there was a concern, and I think it's correct from last stream, that this will not work. We need to encapsulate these conditions inside a closure so they are grouped in the SQL query. And I think this is right, and we will fix that today. So we wrote the code, and if you're new here, the way I build the application is that I write the code that I think will work, and then I write tests to validate the code and make sure that it works. So we wrote the code, let's write the tests. So I have here the user reservation controller test, and this test basically just lists all the reservations in the system, and we make sure that it's only returning reservations that belong to the current logged in user, and each reservation has the office loaded and has an ID. Just some trivial assertions to make sure that the endpoint is responding with the correct JSON structure, and it has the featured image loaded and the office loaded, the office that the reservation belongs to. So what we want to test now, so let's copy this test and we will test that it lists reservations filtered by date range. So now we will remove this, acting as user reservations, and so to write this test we want to have several reservations, and we will include only a few reservations within the date range that we want to test against, and we would assert that we only get those reservations that we expect, and the other reservations that are outside the date range are filtered out. So to do that we will need to create a reservation that, let me take a look at the migration here, start date and end date. So each reservation has a start date and end date. So let's first identify the range that we are going to test against. The filter here inside the user reservation controller, the filter is called from date and to date. So we will have a from date equals, let's have a fixed date, maybe 2021 03 03, and to date 4, so in April the 4th, so from March the 3rd to April the 4th. So these are the tests that this is the range that we are going to test against, and we want to create a reservation within this time frame, and this reservation will have a start date on March 1st and an end date, it will end on March 15th, so it's included inside the date range. It will start before it, but it will end within it. And another reservation that starts before it, so in February, on the 25th of February, and it's going to, let's make it 25th of March, and it's going to end after the range. So this one starts before the range and ends within the range, and this one starts within the range and ends after the range, and we will need another one that starts within the range and ends within the range as well. So 25th to the 29th. So we should expect to see these three reservations when we run this test. So let's go and run this test. PHP artisan test filter equals user reservation controller test, and it lists reservations filtered by range, and all right, we are getting the expected results. But now we are going to create other reservations that are outside the date range. So here, outside the date range, and these ones are within the date range. All right, so the ones outside the date range, let's have ones that start before and end before. So March, so February 25th to March 1st. Yeah, this one starts and ends before the range, and this one starts after the range and ends after the range. Let's run our tests, and we are getting unexpected results because it's now returning all the results instead of just the three results that we would expect. And the reason for that, sorry, the user reservation controller, is this condition here. Let's see the query that runs. So db enable query log, and then after sending the request we are going to db get query log to see the query that ran. And we can see here, all right, we're not actually filtering, right? So http build query, right? And we will provide the start or from date. So from date here, and to date, so to date here. And let's see the query. All right, and here's the query. Select or from reservations where user ID equals something and start date is between this or that, or end date is between this or that. So this condition here will group, or this condition here will bring all the reservations that are in the system. If we remove the DD and run the tests, they are actually passing. I think it's because of the old order of the condition here. So, or end date between, I think this might return results that don't belong to the user. So let's test that. So we will create a reservation within the range, but belongs to a different user. So let's create that, and this one will belong to a different user. Let's see the number of results. So dd JSON response JSON data, and let's run the test, and we get 4. Yeah, we get 4 results, even though we are expecting 3, and that proves that the query is not correct. So let's check the query again, get query log. We run the test, and here is the problem, is that we are telling SQL to bring reservations that belong to this user, and the start rate is between kaza and kaza. I'm sorry if I'm saying kaza, I'm not sure what's the equivalent work in English, this or that. Yeah, this or that. So bring all reservations that belong to this user and that has a start date between this or that, or the end date is between or that. So this or here will bring all results even though the results do not belong to the user. So what we want to do is to enclose this part inside a group. So when SQL evaluates this query, it's going to match both conditions. The one that indicates that the user ID should be equals this, and the start date and end date should be between this and that. I hope it's a bit clear. I'm having a hard time trying to find the words in English to explain the problem, but I hope it's a bit clear by now what we are trying to do. So if we go to the user reservation controller and we say where, provide a closure here, query, return, query. All right, so let me show the how the query will look like now. And you can see here that these conditions are grouped. Before, the conditions were not grouped. So when having the conditions grouped, SQL or MySQL will find records that belong to this user and matches this entire group, not matches the first part and have the where with a different match group that will get us unexpected results. So if we remove that, we expect to see only 3 records. If we run the tests and they pass, we only see those 3 records, and we will verify that these are the records that are returned, not this one and not this one. And to do that, we can just have the reservation 1 equals reservation 2 equals and reservation 3. Is there a typo? No. Reservation. Oh, I'm a king of typos. Reservation, and reservation. And we want to make sure that assert JSON path or fragment. What should we use? Assert JSON structure. Which one should we use? Alright, we want to assert that these are the 3 records that were that should be returned. I'm not sure which method that I should use. Right. Oh, I'm not sure what's the method, but what I can do is just response JSON data, and I'm going to collect this data and I'm going to pluck the IDs. So this should return the IDs of the expected reservations, and I will just assert equals here that the IDs match the reservation 1 ID, reservation 2 ID, and reservation 3 ID. If we run the test, it fails. Because we want to cast this as an array, so to array, and we get the tests passing. I'm sure there is a way to assert that these are the IDs included in the response. I'm sure there is a way, but I'm not familiar with which method I should be using to assert that these IDs are included in the response. So if you have an idea, assert equals, and this method doesn't exist. Yeah, it doesn't exist. All right. Assert JSON structure. Maybe it's assert JSON structure, but I will not waste time trying to remember the method that I should be using. So I will just consider this part as done. We are asserting here using the regular PHP unit assertions. I'm sure there is a way in Laravel to assert that using the helper, the JSON helper methods, but I'm not familiar with it right now. I will refactor that off screen, and you can find it on the GitHub repository after the stream. So we are good with the part. So reservation controller, user reservation controller. So this part is good, which is filtering by from date and to date. We need to also test filtering by status and test filtering by ID. So let's do that. Let's copy this. Oh, no need to copy. So test it filters results by status, and we are going to create a user. And so create a user here and create a reservation that matches the expected status that we want. So the status is so reservation factory create with status of reservation status active, and let's create another reservation. I think there are reservation factory. Yeah, there is a cancelled one. So reservation 2 equals reservation factory state, I think, or what was cancelled. Yeah, we can use cancelled right away and create, right? Cancelled and create. This should create a cancelled reservation, and we are going to, I keep doing this strange stuff with the trackpad. So we are going to copy this, acting as the user and sending the request, filtering by status, and this status should be reservation active, status active here. And we need to verify that the response contains only one record. Oh yeah, we need to verify that the reservation is for user, for this user, and this one also belongs to the user. So let's run the test and see what we get. Art test filter equals, and we go pick the test name, run the test, and we are getting the expected results. We only expect this reservation, so assert JSON path, and the path is data.0.id should be equal the reservation ID. If you run the test, and we are good to go. This test is passing. It's only returning the active reservation. It's not returning the cancelled reservation. Now the missing part is filtering by offices, by an office, a specific office. So it filters results by office. So we have a user and we have an office equals factory or office factory create, and this reservation belongs to this office. We don't care about the status now, and the other reservation belongs to a different office, and we want to filter by office ID and provide this office ID. And we also expect to have a single result, and this result should be the first reservation. So let's run the entire test class. Our test filter equal. Oh, we have a failing test. Yes, this one should be office ID. Still failing. It's returning, yeah, ID, and it's passing. If we filter by office ID, it's going to only return the single result that belongs to this office. It's not going to return the other reservation that doesn't belong to the office that we are filtering for. Quick look at the chat. Why using HTTP build query? It makes it easier to build a query string to pass it to the JSON endpoint. I don't think that this JSON endpoint accepts, because you can provide the data here, but it's excluded. It's not used in this get JSON helper. So I can only pass headers. I cannot pass query parameters. So I'm using the HTTP build query here to build the query parameters for me without having to worry about it. So that should be okay. Now we have this endpoint covered. So user reservation controller. We are only returning records that belong to the user. We verified that we can filter by an office, filter by status, filter by date, and everything should be okay. Problem here is if you are filtering by a status that doesn't actually exist, some random status that doesn't exist, this query will run even though we are sure that it will not return any results. And if you are filtering by an invalid date, this query will run even though we know that it will not return any expected any results because the date is invalid. So usually when this is the case, it's better to validate the input before sending the request or sending the query, so we can lower the number of queries. If the query is not going to return any results, why send it to the SQL server? Just fail before sending it to the SQL server. So we are going to include validation here. So validator, validate, and the validator will accept request all, and the rules are, the rules are, we expect to have a status, and this status should be in reservation. What are the statuses? Active and reservation status cancelled. So we only expect the status to be active or cancelled. If you're sending any other status, we will not send the query, we will just fail. And the other is that from date should be a date, here. So from date should be a date, and it's required with to date. So if you're sending a from date, you should send a to date. If you're sending a to date, you should include a from date. So here and here, let's run the tests. And all is good. Now, if the user sends an invalid date, it sends one date without the other, it sends an invalid status, we are not going to send the request. We can also verify that the office ID is an integer. If we want to verify that the office actually exists, we will send a query before the actual query. So why the extra query? If the user is filtering by a user ID, we will just send the query, a single query, even if the office ID doesn't exist in the system. There is no way we can avoid that without sending another query to verify that the office exists. So we can just ensure that the office ID is an integer. So if you are sending any other data format, we will not send the query. So this should take care of this endpoint. What do you think, guys? Any questions? It looks like a lot of code to be put in the controller. Yeah, I don't like to have a lot of code included in the controller, but I don't enjoy abstractions unless they are needed. So here we are writing a query, right? And this query is essential for this endpoint to run, to perform. These validation rules are essential, so I must include the validation rules, the authorization checks, and build the query within the controller. So it's okay to include this kind of code inside the controller. If, however, I want to refactor this at some point, I can switch to using query scopes, Eloquent model scopes, so I don't have to write this kind of rules inside the controller. But that's only, I do that personally. I only do that when it's essential, when I have to do it and there is no other way. But I'm okay with including queries inside controllers. The repository pattern, I have used the repository pattern in several applications in the past, but I always include the queries in the controller, so it's easier for me to read the controller and find what's going on without having to look at different other classes. So yes, we can refactor that to make the code look more smart, but I don't usually refactor unless things get out of hand. And for this, it's just 1, 2, 3 filters, so 3 query conditions. I don't see that as a problem. Personally, I would make a reservation service class with filter method on it. Yeah, you can do that and move all this code from the controller to another class. But again, this doesn't look so bad to me. Like if it's having a lot of filters and the controller is growing large, maybe yes, we extract it to another class, and this class will have all the filters and the code that writes the query for us. But now this is fine for me. Yeah, in the validation, to date should be after from date. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think it was after from date, right? Let's try that. Nope. No, it's returning an error. So it was date after. Or what was the name of the validation rule? I can't remember, but yeah, it should be after. If you can send me the date. Yeah, after is not correct, so validator. Let's see the validator. Eloquent validation validator, right? Validator, the implementation of the validator, validate after. Yeah, after should be okay. Why is it not working? User reservation controller, so should be after the from date. This should work. Why isn't it working? Let's see the test, user reservation controller test here. Let's see the response, dd response. No, this not this one. This one should be the one failing. dd response JSON, right? We can see the JSON returned. It's not failing. So what is the test that's failing? Nothing is failing, so it works. What did I do wrong the first time to make it not work? All right, it works. All right, sorry about that. Maybe I did a typo. I'm totally fine. I know myself. I do a lot of typos. That's why I prefer copying instead of writing, because I do a lot of mistakes while typing. All right, so this should be all right. Now we have another controller endpoint to work on that's related to listing reservations, which is the one inside the host controller. So there is an index method, and we can just copy parts of this one here because it's basically the same. All right, so here we are filtering. It should have reservations show, right? And we can filter by the status, you can filter by office ID, and you can filter by a user ID as well. If you're trying to find reservations that a user made to one of your offices. And here we want to filter reservations by where relation, I think relation, yes, where relation, and the relation name is office, and the office user ID, was it the user ID? So office the migration, yes, user ID. So office user ID must match the ID of the current logged in user. You can filter by an office, yes, and you can filter by a status, you can filter by a user. So you can filter by a user ID. In that case, we are trying to user ID. You can filter by status, you can filter by from date and due date, and it should return a collection of results similar to the other endpoint. So if you provide an office ID that doesn't belong to you, the query will not return results, because we have this rule here that the reservation should belong to an office that has the user ID matches the current logged in user. So this protects us from trying to look at reservations that belong to an office that doesn't belong to you, and we cannot use a validation to validate that the provided office ID belongs to you, because again we will need an extra query to verify that. So why send two queries instead of one? So we'll just send one query, since we cannot avoid queries in that case. And I think that's it. That's all we need for this endpoint. What do you think? Goal asking why you are using where relation here, because we are trying to filter by reservations that belong to the office, and that office has a user ID that matches the current logged in user. So we are here filtering reservations that are made on an office that belong to me, where I'm not trying to find reservations that are made by me. That's in the user reservation controller. But in the host reservation controller, we are trying to find reservations that were made on my offices. What do you prefer for the route? I prefer host reservations, not reservations host, because there will be an endpoint for reservation to find a reservation by its ID, and I don't want to conflict with that, so host reservations looks better for me. Alright, so if we go to the to-do list, we have this taken care of, we have this taken care of, taken care of, taken care of, taken care of. This is done. The only remaining part is that we want to write tests to cover this, the host reservation controller, but I think there is no need to do that live, because these are going to be tests that are similar to the other tests that test the user reservation controller. So I'm going to do them off session. But what I want to do is to also use query scopes, so we don't have duplicate code here. So user reservation controller. Here we are filtering by office ID, status, blah blah, and we are having a big chunk of duplicate code here. It's fine if we leave it, but it's better to use query scopes instead of writing the code here. So this is something that we will do as a housekeeping task in one of the future streams. So here, convert filtering reservations by date to eloquent scopes. So we will do that at some point in the future, but right now all the tests are passing and we have the list reservations endpoint working as expected. So we are almost out of time, and in the next stream we will start working on the making reservations endpoint, and this endpoint requires some tricky validation, and we need to use locks to make sure the process is atomic. So if two users are trying to make reservations on the same office, the reservations cannot be made at the same time, so the validation rules can run. So we will have to put a lock, so the first user trying to make the reservation will lock the office until the reservation is done, and then the second request will continue. That way we ensure that the validation is solid. So this is something that we are going to work on. And after the reservation is made, we are going to send the reservation details to the user and the host. We are going to send and we are going to schedule an email to be sent on the day of the reservation, the first day of the reservation. And we will generate a Wi-Fi password for this reservation, so hosts can update the Wi-Fi password for the current or the new tenant, and we will send this Wi-Fi password to the user on the day they arrive. And we are going to store the Wi-Fi password encrypted, even though we don't need to store it encrypted, but just to showcase how to encrypt and decrypt data in Laravel. So that's for the next stream. And then we have the cancel reservation endpoint. It also has some cool stuff. And then we will be done with this phase of this application. We will try to deploy it on Forge and Envoyer and Vapor. And after that, we will work on phase 2, which is trying to integrate Laravel Cashier to collect payments on reservations. And we can also integrate a part where we are going to use Laravel Spark to manage subscriptions to allow hosts to promote their offices so they appear first in the search results. That requires a subscription, so we are going to use Laravel Spark for that. So that's the plan for the next streams. I hope this stream was good for you and you learned something. Taking a quick look at the chat. Above performance, isn't it more secure to validate data from requests before using it in a query? Well, validating input before using it is a recommended practice to validate the data. But sometimes, like in this situation, you don't really need to validate if the given user ID is valid, because if it's not valid, like to be able to find if it's valid or not, you are going to make a request to send an SQL query, and the endpoint is already going to send an SQL query. So why send two queries, one to validate that the office ID is correct and the other to collect the results? I prefer to send only one query, and if the office ID is not correct, it will just not return any results. So that's my point of view. Alright, so I think I'm done for today. I see no questions. Alright, so thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the stream. We did some amazing work today on the list reservations endpoint. People can now filter reservations that belong to them, or filter reservations that were made on offices that they offer. So this is quite an important part of the application. and we were able to finish that today. In the next streams, we will continue working on the making reservations and canceling reservations. Then, as I said, we will deploy this application and see where to take it further. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed today, and see you in the next stream.